sounds like a story to me, some crazy fable that you would not believe. Oh, but ain't she...
Welcome to the Avram Davidson universe, where we listen to some of the greatest stories ever written, adored by Ursula Le Guin, Neil Gaiman, Leonard Nimoy, Ray Bradbury, and Stephen King. Enjoy classic tales such as Are All the Seas with Oysters, The Golem, Sources of the Nile, and many others. Hey everybody, I am, as always, super fired up for the Avram Davidson Universe podcast. Today we are going to have our guest. It's actually going to be two episodes. So this is part one with Josh Pachter. He is a mystery writer, and his first short story was written when he was 16. It appeared in Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine in 1968. Since then, he's published more than 100 crime stories in magazines and anthologies in the US and around the world. In 2020, the Two Body Problem won the Derringer Award in the Best Flash Story category. And Josh was awarded the Edgar D. Hoch Memorial Golden Derringer for Lifetime Achievement, making him the first person to receive that award and win a competitive Derringer in the same year. Today, we're going to be listening to the Trefoil Company, which was originally published in Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine in August of 1971. And Josh should be on momentarily. Josh, thanks so much for joining me.
My pleasure. Happy to be here, Seth.
Yeah. So first off, I'd love to hear about how you first discovered Avram.
Oh gosh. Well, I started reading Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine in June of 1966. I remember exactly when it was because I was in the ninth grade, and my ninth grade English teacher, Mary Ryan, one day told me that she wanted me to stay after class, and I thought, oh God, what did I do? But it turned out that it wasn't what I had done. It was something she wanted to do. She had a gift for me, and it was the June 1966 issue of Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine. I have absolutely no idea why she selected me to receive it. I probably had read some Sherlock Holmes stories by then, but I didn't have any real interest in crime fiction other than that. But she gave me the magazine, and I actually brought it home and showed it to my mom and threw it out. And my mom said, no, this is a gift from your teacher. You can't just throw it out. Read it. So I picked it up and I read it. I was absolutely hooked. And from that point on, every month I would get on my bike and pedal a mile to the candy store and plunk down my 35 cents for a copy of the new issue of Ellery Queen's. And exactly 1 year later, in the June of 67 issue, there was a short story called The Memory Bank by Avram Davidson. And I don't have in my memory banks anymore what that story was about. Yep. But what I do remember is that it was so different from anything else that I had been reading over the last year in the magazine that Davidson instantly became one of the writers whose work I would always look for. And he was unique, as you well know, and your listeners and viewers well know, in that when you read a short story by Ellery Queen, when you read a short story by Agatha Christie, when you read a short story by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, you have a fairly good sense of what to expect. But when you see that there's a story by Avram Davidson, you have absolutely no idea what to expect, other than the fact that you can expect the unexpected. And that just totally fascinated me. And I became right away, as soon as I read that first story in June of 67, I became a fan. I only wish that he had published more often in the magazine than he did.
Yeah, wow, that's amazing. And the story of you getting that book is incredible. Your first Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine. Yeah. And then I guess tell us a little bit about yourself. I mean, that propelled you to, as I did an introduction earlier, to have your first published story when you were 16. So tell us a little bit about that and maybe what you're working on,
sure,
on these things as well. Give us kind of the summary from the beginning to now.
Glad to. So I'm reading Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine every month, and They also, at that time, twice a year, published collections of reprints from earlier issues of the magazine. And sometime in '67, right around the same time I became familiar with Avram's work, I read a story in one of those reprint collections by a guy named Richard Deming. And the story was called Open File. It was a police procedural. And the reason it was called Open File was because, unlike most police procedurals, at the end of this one, the cops had failed to solve the crime. And it's 1967, I was 15 years old. And in my wisdom, I thought there were enough clues presented in that story that the cops ought to have been able to solve the crime. So I sat down on my little turquoise manual portable typewriter and I typed up a new ending to the story. And I put it in an envelope and I sent it to the editorial offices of Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine. Some time went by, and in the mail comes a little envelope with the Ellery Queen's logo as the return address. And I opened it up, and inside was a 2-page handwritten letter from Frederick Danae, who was one of the two cousins who wrote together as Ellery Queen, and he was the one who edited the magazine. And he praised what I had done. And although I no longer have the letter, unfortunately, I still have in my memory banks the last two sentences. The way that letter ended was, have you ever considered writing a detective story yourself? Seems to me, Josh, if I may, you should.
Wow.
So of course I did. I sat down and I wrote a short story on my little portable typewriter and put it in an envelope and sent it to his home address. He had given me his home address.
Wow.
And a couple of weeks went by, and this was 1968, so nobody had a cell phone. And in fact, most homes, at least the homes I ever was in, had one telephone downstairs in the kitchen. And the phone downstairs in the kitchen rang, and my mom was down there, and she answered the phone. And she yelled up the stairs, Josh, it's for you. And I yelled back down the stairs, who is it? My mom yelled back up the stairs, it's Frederick Danae. So I went galloping down the stairs and I snatched up the phone and I said, this is not funny, Dad. I just assumed it was my father messing with me.
Oh my gosh.
But it wasn't. It was Frederick Danae. And he was telling 16-year-old me that he wanted to buy my story. So at the age of 16, I became the second youngest person ever to publish in EQMM. I'm still the second youngest. It always pissed me off.
Who's the first? Do you know?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I do. There's a guy named James Yaffe who wrote a wonderful series of short stories about a Jewish grandmother who's always just referred to as Mom. Her son is a cop, and he would bring home to the dinner table cases that he had been having some difficulty with. And Mom would figure out the solution to the cases. And for many, many years, I kind of half resented this guy, Jim Yaffe, because he had gotten into Ellery Queen's at a year younger than I did. He was 15 when they first published him in the mid-1940s, early in the history of the magazine. And not terribly long ago, I finally thought, I met a lot of these people over the course of the years, but I never met him. And I thought, I wonder if the guy is still alive. It would be fun to talk to him. So I looked him up online and found out that he had died like the week before. So I just missed him. But anyway, so I had my first story at 16 in EQMM, and that was 55 years ago. I'm still writing. My next story in the magazine will be they now publish every other month. And my next story will be in the May-June 2024 issue. It's a story called Texas Kinda Attitude, which is the title of a song by a guy named Dan Hicks, who's also no longer with us. And it's the seventh or eighth story in a series I've been doing about a Texas private investigator.
Very cool.
So they're a lot of fun to write. I just sold the most recent one to a book that's coming out next year, an anthology of stories by people who have won either the Agatha Award, which is named after Agatha Christie and given out every year at the Malice Domestic Crime Fiction Conference, or people who've won the Derringer Award, which is which I've won, which is given out by the Short Mystery Fiction Society. So for 55 years now, I've been writing short crime fiction. I also edit it. I've edited about 20 anthologies, something like that. And then I also translate. I lived for some years in the Netherlands and learned to speak Dutch. And I translate mostly short fiction, but also some novels, couple novels, and some nonfiction and some graphic novels from Dutch to English.
Oh, wow. I'll have to send you, just so you know, Avram recently had 2 of his novels translated into Dutch.
Oh, really?
I'll have to
cool.
send him. I don't know if you prefer to read them in English.
Actually, I find reading in Dutch a lot of fun. I'm at a point now where most of the pleasure reading that I do, and because of the editing I do, I don't have a huge amount of time for pleasure reading. But most of the pleasure reading I do these days is Dutch.
Well, that's fun.
In fact, I just had, after 55 years of short stories, I just had my first novel came out in September, and it is called Dutch Threat. And it's set right here. It's set in a place called the Begijnhof, which is a little community for women only in the heart of downtown Amsterdam. It's been there for 900 years.
Oh, wow. That's
so, you know, I do a lot of stuff that has to do with the publishing industry. I also spent 50 years as a teacher. I just retired last year from a 50-year career in education.
Wow. That's amazing. And you've done a lot. Well, let's talk a little bit about the story we're going to be listening to today, which
Sure.
Thank you for personally narrating it. That's a special treat, and I think you did a fantastic job. So I'm excited to share that with the listeners. But why this story?
So the Trefoil Company was in the August 1971 issue of Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine. And in that same issue was my third published story, which is a piece called Sam Buried Caesar. And if that sounds familiar, it's because it was a spoof on Nero Wolfe. It was a Nero Wolfe book called Some Buried Caesar. In the Nero Wolfe book, Caesar is a bull, an important competitive prize-winning bull. In my story, Caesar is a dog. And so I picked the Trefoil Company because it was the first time that Avram and I ever appeared in between the same book covers together. And it was fun to go back and reread it. I hadn't read it in quite a while. And it just really refreshed my memory on everything that I like about the work of Avram Davidson.
So before we listen to the story, it is a very puzzling story. And I had to go through it a few times, and I'm still not totally clear on everything that's happening. Without giving anything away, is there any hint or clue to help maybe listeners ahead of time process the story? And I apologize, I'm asking you off the top, top of your head here, but any hint or clue? Just it's a little baffling. With I know that, and I'll just say this: I know that in the publication there was a little blurb by the editors saying that this is a puzzle, that this is a little bit of a puzzle story. So listeners, beware. It is unique. Any thoughts on that question that we could share? Or should we just go into it and then discuss?
I don't think it would be fair to prime your listeners and viewers for this particular story. I think that you just have to take it on its own merits, and then maybe we can talk about it on the flip side.
All right, let's do it. You ready to dive in?
Sure.
All right.
No, said Mrs. Nolte. who had been with the firm for quite some time, "That's certainly no matter to take up the first thing with old Herbert. What the first thing he ever learned was, buy at 90 days, sell at 30 days. And if you come up with some notion of how to buy at, say, 91 days and sell at, say, 29 days, then he'd be the very first partner you want to talk to, but not about serving any little sandwiches with the coffee break. No, not him. Not him." Marlene, who was new at the Trefoil Company, said, "Well, I didn't know. My brother-in-law's sister was the one who showed me this clipping from the house newspaper where he works, and it's got a lot of figures in it, so I thought, old Herbert." Mrs. Nolte took Marlene and the clipping in with her to see Mr. George and talk about it. Mrs. Nolte didn't want all the credit if the idea went over, and she didn't want all the blame if it didn't. "Brightens the coffee break and adds to employee efficiency at small cost," he read. Then he rubbed his mustache. "Something to think about," he said, scribbling his initials on the clipping and making a note on his pad. "Tell you what, see if Les has any ideas. I'll tell him you're coming in," he said, reaching to the intercom. I appreciate your discussing it with me. Never too busy to talk to our own employees." Lester, who was on top of his funny desk, dressed in leotards and sitting in the lotus position, said nothing to them as they entered. Mrs. Nolte never blinked an eyelash and held the clipping in front of his face. She must have just stood there a whole minute. Then, all of a sudden, he jumped up, took the clipping from her, and started turning cartwheels across the floor. "Thanks, Lester," she said, giving Marlene a poke, and out they went. "Oh, he's so handsome," the girl said, "but what a nut!" Serene was the word for Mrs. Nolte. "When they're that important, you don't call them nuts," she said. "You used to term them eccentric, but now the word is creative. Boy, is he ever creative, Lester." Marlene snickered. "Well, at least he had something like clothes on just now," she said. Mrs. Nolte gave her a look. "Only what I heard, but if you ever hear me scream—" The older woman nodded and repeated the last word in a low tone of voice, skeptically. An order went down to the design shop marked Rush, Less, and some weird things came back up. "Darndest looking cookie cutters I ever seen," was the comment of Al, the foreman. Mr. George spoke to Mrs. Nolte about them. When she took old Herbert his invariable lunch of a glass of milk, an apple, and a ham sandwich, the weird things were on the plate, all put together somehow. Old Herbert looked up from his sheets and sheets of figures and gestured. Mrs. Nolte pressed down on the sandwich. He took the pieces of it apart easily. Now there were 7 or 8 cute little sandwiches, all in different and funny designs. "Man is right," said old Herbert. "No waste pieces at all. Waste not, want not. Man sometimes has good ideas." Mrs. Nolte said, "I bet you don't always have the same supper as you do lunch." "Man doesn't want a sandwich when he comes home from work. Man wants pot roast and potatoes." He squared his gray-suited shoulders, picked up a bite to eat and a sheet of figures. Mr. George was jovial in the elevator with the Trefoil Company employees. Mr. George was going to a fancy restaurant with a few prospective customers. Sometimes Les cooked himself a pot of pickled snails or something like that. Sometimes he ate a big bag of organic pumpkin chips or something like that. And sometimes he was seen in mod clothes at a hot dog stand with the shipping clerks. By the time Mrs. Nolte saw old Herbert again, he had figured out a new way to save the company 3 mils per gross on another item. Also, he waved his hand at the funny sandwich cutters. "Might pay us to put in a line of those," he said. "Ask planning to work on it." He picked up his sheets of figures. Mrs. Nolte took the memo for planning into Mr. George for his initials. He was slightly more red-faced than usual, and he smelled of the best brandy and was humming as he blocked out a new contract. Les was wearing cricket flannels, and with him, and also wearing cricket flannels, was one of them. "Nolte, this is Darcy Plantagenet from Jamaica, who will be working with me on, things," said Lester. Darcy Plantagenet of Jamaica looked critically at Les's stance. "I said, show me a leg," said Darcy Plantagenet of Jamaica. The funny little sandwiches were a big success at the afternoon coffee break, with tea optional, as an experiment. Although none were left over to get stale, everyone seemed to have had enough. The consensus was that a breakdown of 3/5 from the Trefoil Company and 2/5 from the employees' rec fund would be sufficient to pay for the little sandwiches in the future. A woman named Elaine from the steno pool, who was fairly ugly and no chicken, didn't want any, however, and after Mrs. Nolte had conferred with her in the ladies' lounge and made her blow her nose, they went in to see Mr. George. "Elaine says she is in the family way, and she names Lester," said Mrs. Nolte, getting right to the point. Mr. George said, "Oh, my. Well, I am very, you have my complete... Well, now, Elaine, have you discussed this with Lester?" She nodded. "Either he laughs," she said, "or he gives me a list of the craziest names for children you ever saw. Or like that last time, he made me an indecent proposition. I suppose I'll have to destroy myself by jumping off a building or something," she said glumly. But Mr. George showed how shocked he was and brought her a glass of water himself. "There is a very discreet agency we can contact for you," he said. "Or there is, I believe, a doctor in, Now it was Elaine's turn to be shocked. Then she lit a cigarette, put her elbows on his desk, and leaned forward. "No, you see," she explained, "I have this aunt and uncle, and they never had any children. But I can't show up there till afterwards, because they got to be able to say it's a regular adoption because of the neighbors." Mr. George, nodding very rapidly, assured her that he understood perfectly and that all arrangements would be made, including expenses. "Only, you understand, Elaine, that old Herbert must never know. He just wouldn't understand. So then, Mrs. Nolte, make out the check for, He winked elaborately. She knew. "And what did you say, Elaine?" "Oh, certainly. Oh, yes, we want you to come back. And you mustn't think too badly of Les. He's young, and he's very, creative," said Mrs. Nolte. At 5:05, she started turning out the lights for the benefit of old Herbert, who never checked the other floors anyway. Then she turned out the lights in the office of Mr. George and the office of Lester. On the funny desk was an unfinished collage of rose petals, candy wrappers, and bus transfers. And into the changing room, of course, she never went. The traffic was worse than usual, and it took him a full hour getting home. His mother-in-law was visible 2 rooms away, as she usually was, no matter what room he happened to be in. His wife said, "I hope you had a good day at the office. The store made another mistake about my charge account, and Meg wants to spend the weekend in New York with that exchange student and his family, and of course he hasn't really got a family there, and Mr. McDonald telephoned and said he'd call back." He said, "Oh, nuts." "Well, that's the way it is, and I can't do anything about it. What I can do anything about is a dry martini, a nice home-cooked meal, lots of loving, and a good night's sleep." The phone rang, and they both turned to it, but the mother-in-law got to it first. "Herbert George Lester residence," they heard her say. Then she pointed. He picked up the extension. "Speaking," he said.
So I'm tripped out by this story.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah, it's an amazing piece of work. One of the things that fascinates me about it the most is not even so much the story itself, but the fact that Fred Dene bought it for Ellery Queen's mystery magazine, because it's not a mystery story, it's not a crime story. Uh, it's barely a story when you get right down to it. It's a lot of words strung together in proper sentence form. But you listen to it or you read it, and at the end, if you're not just shaking your head thinking either he was on drugs when he wrote it or I must just have been on drugs while I was accessing it, then you probably didn't pay enough attention to it. It's just a marvelously weird, bizarre story.
And so why do you think he published it? I mean, and just real quick, going back to, I had a conversation a while back with Michael Swanwick about a Doubleday novel that Avram basically had promised to deliver some novels. He didn't. He sent them some material, and they're like, "All right, we'll publish this." And it wasn't what they planned to publish. Maybe Avram owed a story, or I don't know, but on the other hand, Avram had such a mix of incredibly literary stories that fit well within the genre, and then he'd write something like this. So anyways, I guess I had two questions for you. One, why did he publish it, you think? And then do you have any sense of the puzzle? And I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that I noted, but I'll let you chat because I'm confused.
Well, all right, as far as why did Fred publish it goes, I have no idea. I wasn't there at the time, and I don't have any access to his head. You can't ask him. Fred died in 1981 or 1982. Yeah. But if I had to guess, I would guess that his reaction to the story was similar to mine, which is that he read it and he thought, I don't exactly know what this is. I don't exactly know why I would put it in my magazine, but I can't not. It's just too fascinating to not publish. As far as the puzzle of the story goes, are you asking me to explain it?
I think okay. Let's go through it first. Things that we know. So I wrote down a bunch of the characters' names as I'm trying to puzzle it out. There's Nolte, there's Herbert, there's Marlene, there's George, there's Lester. There's this woman who gets pregnant, and then they pick up the phone, and Herbert George Lester picks up the phone getting a call from work. I think it was something like that. So we kind of know what's going on. And that's sort of as far as I got. After that, it's sort of guesswork, but maybe you have some more insight, and I have some thoughts as well. But that's the information.
Remember that the title of the story is the name of the company, the Trefoil Company.
Yep.
And what a trefoil is it's a symbol. It's basically the symbol you would see in a deck of cards on each of the clubs. And that it's got three pieces or three sort of bulbous parts to it. And as I read the Trefoil Company, it's the three faces of Eve. This is not three different men. This is one man. There's a reference about 2/3 of the way through the story about how the secretary never goes into the changing room. And the changing room is only mentioned that one time. It never comes up again. But so what is the changing room? The changing room is the room that Herbert George Lester goes into to change clothes and probably facial configuration, whether he does it in some mystical fantasy way or whether he does it just like you would do it or I would do it if we were dressing up for Halloween. He is all three characters, and everybody either plays along. It's hard to imagine that Marlene, if I remember correctly, is the secretary. It's hard to imagine that she doesn't realize that it's all the same guy. I can believe that the pregnant woman doesn't recognize that it's all the same guy, but there's never even the slightest hint of an explanation of why. Why does this guy have these three personalities? Is he suffering from some kind of um, multiple personality disorder, or is he just playing and having fun? We don't know, and it doesn't really matter. What matters is the fact that this is how the Trefoil Company operates. It's got three people in charge, but they're all the same guy, just being three different people at work. At home, he's Herbert George Lester. The three personalities are integrated into one. And so when he picks up the phone, it's Herbert George Lester speaking. But at work, it's either Herbert or George or Lester alternately. That's my take. What goes through your mind?
So two things. We have a mystery here. So maybe that's why it was, I mean, there is a mystery, and maybe that's the reason it was published. I mean, this is fun. We're all trying to figure out what exactly is going on. So here lies the mystery. I like your thoughts much more than mine. What I kept thinking about is maybe Herbert George Lester's just imagining all this in his head, and the idea that he sort of created this company, and maybe he's the idea that he has gotten maybe there's this gal at work that he likes and he's able to have sex with her. I don't know, but we haven't even touched on, who is it? Darcy
Plantagenet,
from
Jamaica.
I mean, who's she?
I don't know. Darcy is there for one or two, I guess, paragraphs. He has one thing to say, something about Lester's leg, and then, like the changing room, he disappears, and you never see or hear anything about him again. And it's this is why I said earlier, it's hard. Now you said there is a mystery there, and see, I would say not that it's a mystery, but that it's mysterious.
Right.
And there's a difference between mystery and mysterious. I'm going to step off to the side just for a moment and tell you that one of the first books I edited back in the 1980s was I edited an anthology of horror stories. It was called Top Horror. And the idea, I actually did four of these. Top Crime was the first one, then Top Science Fiction, Top Fantasy, and Top Horror. And for all four of them, the idea was that I approached the top writers in those genres at the time, middle 1980s. And I asked them to send me their best crime story, their best fantasy story, and a one-page explanation of why they had picked it as their best. Okay, fine. So one of the people I contacted for Top Horror was Stephen King. Mm-hmm. And I said, send me your best horror story. And he sent me one of the most stunningly brilliant short pieces of fiction I've ever read in my life, a story called Survivor Type. And I was living in Germany at the time, and this was before the internet, so this was all happening via transatlantic snail mail. And I wrote back to Stephen King and I said, I love this story. It's absolutely brilliant, but I can't use it because it's not a horror story. It's a horrifying story, but not a horror story. And he actually wrote me back and said, you know what, I agree with you. And sent me three more and said, how about one of these? I wrote him back and said, no, that's not the way it works. You have to pick. So, and in fact, I don't know how many people have ever rejected Stephen King, but I was one of them back in the 1980s. Anyway, that's kind of the way I feel about the difference between a mystery story and a mysterious story. And one of the conventions in the mystery story is that the mystery has to be solvable. And another convention of the mystery story is that the mystery in most cases has to actually wind up solved, which is why that story I mentioned earlier that motivated me to write a new ending, Open File, was such an unusual story in that the mystery wasn't solved in the framework of the story. But so I think this is a mysterious story, but there's never any answers that are provided, which I think is what prevents it from being a mystery story. I like the idea that maybe it's all going on in his head. I think that's interesting. But I think it's actually more interesting if it's not just happening in his head, it's happening in the building that houses the Trefoil Company. and why is it happening, and why do the other people buy into it, and what happens next? None of that is ever answered. So you're just sort of left shaking your head going, wow, I'm not exactly sure what I just read, but it certainly was fascinating. And now that we're talking about it, I wonder if to a certain extent it might have been Avram's work that contributed to a story that I wrote for Ellery Queen's a couple of years later called Invitation to a Murder, which ends without a resolution. Like this story ends without a resolution.
So
I actually got I got a letter from Fred at one point after the story appeared in print, telling me that he had received more mail about my story than he had ever received about any story he had ever published up to that point. And the letters all said basically the same thing. They all said, I love that story, but I have no idea what happens at the end. Can you please tell me? And that's kind of how I feel about the Trefoil Company. I have no idea, but it was fascinating.
so here's what just struck me is, did you ever read, and it was more on the science fiction side. Some people argue it's not a science fiction story, but did you ever read the story won the Hugo Award for, which is O'er All the Seas with Oysters?
Yes.
Okay. So in that, I just realized I had the same discussion, same debate. And in that story, I mean, basically, what I decided was ultimately Avram is messing with us. There is no answer. And I wonder, I mean, and that story was a good length. This story is very short. And if you think about it, this is actually incredibly brilliant to have this short of a story that's creating this kind of a discussion in the same way that O'er All the Seas with Oysters did, which is he may be telling us, yeah, this could be 5 different answers.
Yeah, I always think that is a lot of people don't like that. A lot of readers don't like that. They want all the pieces to be tied together on a nice, neat bow. But I find that intriguing. I mean, one of my favorite short stories of all time was a story by Frank Stockton that I know you're familiar with, called The Lady or the Tiger, where at the end of the story, there are 2 completely different possible endings. And he doesn't tell you which is the correct one. I actually have a story that just came out this week in a book called Mickey Finn, 21st Century Noir, Volume 4, edited by a wonderful writer-editor named Michael Bracken, published by Down and Out Books. And in my story, which is called Lucifer Falls, the main character is a New York publisher who is working on a high-quality illustrated edition of Frank Stockton's The Lady or the Tiger. So that story is referenced in my story. And my story ends with that same kind of a Lady or the Tiger. You just don't know which one of 2 possible ways it could have gone. And I like that. I think that's fun because, look, for the most part, short stories, from the perspective of the reader, are like a bowl of popcorn. Nobody ever dips his hand or her hand into a bowl of popcorn and eats a piece of popcorn and then talks about it. You eat a piece of popcorn and then you just eat the next piece and then you just eat the next piece. And I think that's the way most people read short stories. If you've got a book of them or a magazine filled with them, you just read them and you don't stop to really think about them unless they're exceptional. And I think that it's stories like Stockton's Lady or the Tiger and Avram's The Trefoil Company that have that effect on the reader. You can't just reach back into the bowl for the next one. You have to stop. And if you don't have somebody to talk to about it, at least you have to talk to yourself about it. You have to think about it. And it lingers with you in a way that makes it very special.
And what's fascinating about this story again is when I read Or All the Seas with Oysters and some of Avram's other stories, there obviously brilliant. Like, you know, I've just read a brilliant story. And then you read a story like this and you go, I don't know what to think about it. And then we have this conversation and I go, oh my God, this is another incredibly brilliant story
Yeah.
that I'm not sophisticated enough without having this conversation to realize, wow, this is another amazing Avram story that I just kind of read quickly the first time a year ago as I'm reading through, 400 of his stories, that now that I have some time to really let it resonate with me, that, wow, what an amazing story.
Now, a couple of minutes ago, you mentioned how amazing it was that he could do all this in such a short such a small number of words. But I think there's also a downside to that, which is that given how short the experience of reading it is, I think it's easier just to let it roll by you. So on the one hand, if you think about it, there's a lot to think about. But on the other hand, it's just so short. It's possible that there might be people who just don't give it the thought that it really deserves. Hopefully, this conversation won't only have the effect on you of having you reevaluate it, but will have that effect on others as well.
So I'm gonna put this out there, listeners. Send me a message. Tell me, I'm so curious what you think about this. If you'd like a copy of this, let me know. Send me a message. I'll give it to you so you can read it along with listening to it. Because I'd love to hear what other folks think of this story, because it's such a unique story with information that we don't necessarily have. So I'll put that out there. I usually talk about adaptations of some of his stories. I don't want to take a lot of time on this here. Because it's such a slice, but I still every time want to touch on it. If you were to adapt this, any thoughts on what you would do with it?
Oh, I think it'd be fascinating to adapt it for one of the visual media, for television or for film. And I think what would be so interesting about it would be the casting. How there would perhaps be a temptation, which I think would be a mistake, to cast three different actors to play Herbert, George, and Lester. I think really what you have to do is you have to cast the same person.
Wow.
Have you ever seen the film Happy New Year?
No.
We watch it every year on New Year's Eve because
Okay.
it's Happy New Year is the name of it. It's with Peter Falk, and Peter Falk it plays in the same way that in Dr. Strangelove, How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb by Stanley Kubrick, has Peter Sellers playing three different parts. In Happy New Year, Peter Falk plays three different parts. But the difference is that in Dr. Strangelove, you've got Peter Sellers playing three really honestly different characters, where in Happy New Year, Peter Falk is pretending to be two other people in addition to himself. And I think what would be really fascinating if this was adapted visually was to have a performer who had the ability to play those three different parts, and the viewer wouldn't realize that it was the same actor.
Wow.
Until the end of the story, when somehow
Whoa.
visually, when it's Herbert George Lester who picks up the phone, you would see, oh my God, it's the same guy. He's all three of them. And that would be just such, I think, a stunning moment. There's a stunning, I don't want to spoil it, but there's a stunning moment like that in the movie Magic with Anthony Hopkins. It's based on a novel by William Goldman. There's a stunning moment like that in the movie, the first version, Sleuth, with Michael Caine and Laurence Olivier, based on a stage play. There's a stunning moment in the film The Crying Game, which is not really a crime film.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
But
Well,
I think you could have that kind of a stunning moment if the one person playing all three parts was able to do it in such a way that the audience didn't realize it until the end.
wow. The only question there is, then you're telling everyone what's happened in the story. as in it's your, what's interesting there would be you're giving our vision or your vision of what this story is about, as opposed to could you do this in a way where it leaves a question? Is that what really happened here? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do, and I think that might be a mistake for an adaptation
Yeah.
into
No, you're
visual
probably right.
media.
Yeah.
There's a Canadian media scholar named Marshall McLuhan who said that media have temperature. You had hot media, you had cold media, and the difference is how much work does the consumer have to do? And the more work the consumer has to do, the hotter the medium. And the flip side of that is that the hotter the medium, the less likely it is to be popular.
Makes
Well,
sense.
the visual media, television and film are very, very cold medium. Most of the work is done for the viewer. When you read the Harry Potter books, you have to imagine what Harry looks like. You have to imagine what Harry sounds like and all the other characters. When you see the movies, well, okay, it's Daniel Radcliffe. You can see him, you can hear him. You don't have to engage your imagination. And as popular as the books are, the movies are just as popular, if not more so. Most, at least in America, most media consumers are more likely to want to see the movie, to see the TV show, than to read the book, because we tend to be fairly lazy. We don't want to work as hard as a book makes us work, most of us. Fortunately, there are still some readers out there for the sake of people like me who write. But I think that if you're going to take this piece of paper short story, the Trefoil Company, and turn it into a visual medium, you have to chill it down some for the viewer in order for because that's what people who consume visual media expect.
Makes sense. Well, look, this has been amazing. And again, I can't thank you enough for narrating it. I am excited. I know we're doing a second episode, so I'm really excited to go into that. And we will do that shortly.
Sounds good.
Oh,
Thank you again.
suppose God only knows. It sounds like a story to me, some crazy fable that you would not believe.